United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, in a statement marking the International Holocaust Remembrance Day on Monday, recalled how 8 decades earlier, the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camps were liberated. Turk said, exhausted, emaciated, terrified, and sick, those 7,000 were all that remained of the 1.3 million men, women, and children who had been deported to Auschwitz. Holocaust Remembrance Day, he went on, is a wake-up call to the dangers of indifference, complacency, and apathy, and a reminder of the duty to stand up against intolerance. Today, hateful rhetoric is reverberating across much of the world. Anti-Semitism is rampant on our streets and online. Jews face increasing intimidation, threats, and physical violence. In closing, he said that he urged people to fight for dignity and human rights, to condemn and prevent anti-Semitism, bigotry, intolerance, and hatred. Discrimination and dehumanization are winning out over solidarity and compassion. Diversity is viewed as a threat rather than something to be treasured, and leaders around the world are undermining and weakening the rule of law at a moment when we must celebrate diversity. I have to admit, when I read his words, the first thought that came to my mind was, it was nice of him to notice. But perhaps he needs to look in the mirror a little bit and hold up the mirror to his own organization, who in the past 15 months have helped foster and enable some of the most virulent anti-Semitic attacks and statements. It's not enough to celebrate Holocaust Remembrance Day once a year. If its message is to have real meaning, then it has to be observed and noted every day. This dissonance, if you will, between statements and reality, between spoken words and actions, has been an ongoing phenomenon for months and years. Released this week was a study that showed that more than half of the top 25 US medical schools experienced overt acts of anti-Semitism and pro-terror statements in the midst of graduations. For anybody who watched graduations in May of last year, you know that this was true. Our daughter graduated from the University of Toronto, and it was not immune to such phenomena. I guess the advantage of watching from a distance meant that the camera turned away from some of the most egregious visuals and muted the sound of the most outrageous statements. But it didn't change the reality that the statements were made and heard and accepted and tolerated. At these medical schools, places where one would hope the graduates and the people going through the program were being taught about empathy and compassion. And yet you had students who wore 3-part stoles consisting of the Palestinian flag, a keffiyeh, and a map of Israel that was empty, with words suggesting that it should be empty of all Jews. Apparently, in certain schools, some students believe that empathy, compassion, concern for other human beings does not seem to include Jewish people. At Weill Cornell, a student delivered a loud protest while on the stage, accusing the professors of complicity with genocide, while other students marched around the invited guests chanting, "Free, free, free Palestine," and calling for the destruction of the Jewish state and a removal of Jews from Israel. At the commencement ceremony at Brown University, students chanted, "From the river to the sea," a Hamas terrorist charter statement conveying the desire to annihilate the state of Israel and all Jews resident therein. In one of the odd pieces I came across this past week was a story captioned, "A mezuzah is now at a door opening to the horrors of Auschwitz." And it tells the story of a woman who lived for 42 years in a 3-story house overlooking a former gas chamber and a gallows at Auschwitz. She says that occasionally she lost a little bit of sleep thinking about what happened on the other side of her garden. But overall, this home that was once the home of the death camp's wartime commander, Rudolf Hess, was, and I quote her directly, "a great place to raise children." A home which became the subject of an Oscar-winning movie, The Zone of Interest, had, she said, safety, silence, and a beautiful garden, easy access to a river across the road, and in the winter, space for an ice skating rink for her 2 boys to use. Now alone in the house, after her husband died and her sons grew up and moved, she decided to leave, in part because she was being disturbed by people who, having seen the movie, were now tramping through her garden and peering through her windows. And the ongoing reminders of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, were becoming too real for her. And so she sold her house to an organization called the Counter Extremism Project, a New York-based group that wanted to and now has opened the house to the public. The house at 88 Legiono Street, which is just outside the Auschwitz camp perimeter, has been prepared to receive visitors for the first time and has been restored as it was when the Haas family lived there from 1941 to 1944, including the return of Nazi-era locks on the bathroom door, indicating whether they were in use or not. The oddity, and what gave rise to the caption, was that while everything post-war was removed and the house was restored to what it would have looked like when the camp commandant and his family lived there, there's a mezuzah on the door. It doesn't feel right. At least it doesn't feel right to me. The story is so banal on one level. Imagine, if you will, living for over 4 decades, and when you looked out your window, Auschwitz. In part, answer may lie In a story by Alan Little of BBC News, in which he traces the arc of Holocaust remembrance. He says, post-war Europe looked at the horror, acknowledged the depth of suffering, but could not and would not address the question of what was the moral collapse that turned that horror into normality for the Nazis who ran these camps and committed these atrocities. He notes that some Nazi war criminals were prosecuted, but that public attention post-war had a new priority: a Europe that was divided by the Cold War and the goal of turning West Germany into a democratic ally and rebuilding as much as possible. In the 50s, he says, the Holocaust virtually disappeared from public memory as the post-war public wanted to turn the page on the war, and in public culture, the appetite was for stories of heroism that could be celebrated rather than horrors be reflected upon. Primo Levi, who wrote the book, If This Is a Man, a book now acknowledged to be one of the great records of the experience of Auschwitz that he wrote as a survivor. In the 1950s, he could not find a publisher. Finally found a small publishing house in Turin in Italy, where he was from, and they printed 2,500 copies. 1,500 were sold, the other 1,000 disappeared, and it would be years and years before it was reprinted and made available to the greater public. The Diary of Anne Frank, which has sold over 30 million copies. Anne Frank's father also couldn't find a publisher for the book. The world did not want to look into the face of evil. In the 1950s, Holocaust memorialization was fragmented and generally done only by Jews. In the 1960s, he says, anti-war attitudes, especially amongst young people, and the Eichmann trial that brought the villain into the living room of people around the world, triggered a desire for public memorialization that began to grow, and that by the 1990s was normative and perhaps culminated in the early 2000s, 2005, when the United Nations actually declared January 27th to be International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But if that was the arc, then almost at the same moment that the UN was adopting this as a day to remember, the world again began to forget. Study after study has shown how few people, especially amongst young people, know anything about the Holocaust. France, in England, America, where there are required components of curriculum to focus on it, ignorance that is stunning and shocking. Germany, where Holocaust education has been part of the fabric for decades, where German reparations have been part of the fabric of German society, They too are seeing an incredible rise in the fascist right, supported and encouraged by billionaires whose wealth and whose residence is here in America. So I want to thank Volker Turk for noticing that there's a target on the backs of Jews around the world. That the same ugly anti-Semitism that began, that erupted a century ago is threatening to repeat itself. Marianne Miller, who as a survivor came to speak at the UN memorial event this past week, that anti-Semitism is lifting its ugly head again across the world. We must remember God created people to love, not to hate. God wants to be proud of mankind, not ashamed of it. That is our task. That is our responsibility. And at the UN, Israeli President Isaac Herzog accused the UN and other international institutions of forgetting that they were created in response to the Shoah and to the hatreds that Nazi Germany spread throughout Europe and the world. I quote Herzog, "This moral and ethical lighthouse has been eroded and allowed itself to be eroded time and time again. How is it possible that international institutions, which began as an anti-Nazi alliance, are allowing anti-Semitic genocidal doctrines to flourish uninterrupted in the wake of the largest massacre of Jews since World War II?" This question is rhetorical, but it demands an answer as well. Averim, we are the answer. We have to decry in every possible moment the statements of hatred against ourselves and against any group. What Marianne Miller suggested has to be our watchword and our mandate. We need to remind people that there is a spark of divinity and holiness that exists in every single human being, Jews and non-Jews. And the Holy One wants us to see that spark of holiness and treat every human being as an expression of sanctity. Because if we do not, in the past of these dwindling number of Shoah survivors may be the future that we bequeath to our children. Choice is ours. May we make the right one. Averim, let me invite you to turn back to your Sidurim.